seminar. We are honored to have Dr. Barber talk on studying political conflict, learning lessons about resilience. I'm just going to say a few things about Dr. Barber. His CV is 26 pages long, so I'll make this as brief and meaningful as possible. He is an Adjunct Professor of Psychology at the University of Tennessee in the US, and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Youth and Political Conflict. He's also a technical advisor to the World Health Organization and to UNICEF. Dr. Barber's research is on adolescent development in social contexts in Africa, Asia, the Balkans, Europe, the Middle East, and North and South America. He specializes in the study of adolescent development in context of political conflict, particularly in Palestine, Bosnia, and Egypt. His work has been supported by the U.S. National Institute for Mental Health, the Social Science Research Council, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Jerusalem Fund, and the United States Institute for Peace. Most frequently, he was also funded by the Jacobs Foundation for two studies. One is a 4-year study of the long-term consequences of conflict exposure and involvement of Palestinian youth, and a 2-year study of youth of the Egyptian Revolution. Dr. Barber publishes his work regularly in leading social science journal. He's also the author / editor of a journal called Intrusive Parenting, How Psychological Control Affects Children and Adolescents. I'm sorry, it's a book from 2002, and another book by Oxford University Press titled Adolescents and War, How Youth Deal with Political Conflict. So join me in welcoming Dr. Barber.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm really very pleased to be here in Lebanon. It's my first visit to your country. I've been coming to the region for nearly 20 years, studying Palestinians for a long time, and now Egyptians. But had the chance to come to Beirut. I'm pleased to be here and hope to be able to return. I will not spend much time today talking about the specific research findings from both of those projects, although I would love to do that on another occasion. Rima Afifi asked me maybe to talk about resilience, and I don't know how seriously she meant that suggestion, but I took it quite seriously, in part because the concept of resilience in my mind is a troublesome and problematic construct. Recently I was invited to write a chapter for a Springer volume on an encyclopedia on Children and War, and they asked me to talk about the concept of resilience and how it might be useful or not in understanding youth and political conflict. So what I decided to do today was kind of share those thoughts with you, and I hope it doesn't get too esoteric, but it is an illustration, I think, of how we have to be careful with the terminology we use and the concepts that we use. Essentially, my problem with the concept of resilience is that in many of its usages, it implies that adaptive functioning in the face of adversity is rather extraordinary, and it's only the resilient of us who are able to deal with those, when in fact the reverse is true. Any literature that we study, whether it be conflict literature or grief literature or loss literature, suggests that most human beings adapt effectively to the adversities that we face, and that it's not an extraordinary percent that we have to look for and find the magic reasons why they, above all, have been able to survive. And this has consequences, I think, for how we approach research and how we make interpretations of it. So let me try to lay out that argument for you in a little bit more elaborate way. So there is this basic paradox that given the extremity of risk associated with political conflict and war, few young people are expected to survive it well, that is, the resilient of them. However, the evidence indicates that most do. So this is a fundamental paradox that needs some resolution. How, in other words, can a majority be considered resilient? That's a contradiction in terms. Many of you perhaps are experts on resilience. Forgive me if I misspeak some of this, but I've tried to study a very complex literature in preparation for this chapter. It is a very convoluted and fuzzy literature, resilience is. Chris Lane, for example, identifies at least 8 different definitions of the construct as it's used in clinical psychology and trauma psychology. So you want to have to wade our way through a very complicated and very confusing literature. So I did that and made a couple of 3 actually basic presumptions that the literature seems to imply, and I'll defend those. So resilience requires risk. Resilient functioning is uncommon. And political conflict can entail such extreme adversity that resilience would be even rarer in that group of people. Those are the 3 kind of presuppositions that one can draw by reading the literature's conceptual definitions of resilience. Let me address those systematically. Risk is required to distinguish resilience from positive adjustment and competence, because one argument could be, well, what is different between resilient functioning and positive functioning? Well, those who defend the construct of resilience say the difference is that resilient functioning exists in response to the presence of a risk or adversity, as opposed to more normative developmental functioning. To be considered resilient, children must have overcome a threat or hazard to adaptation. These are quotations from resilient scholars. Relatively positive psychological functioning when combined with serious risk experiences. Now, it should be said, and here's an illustration of the complexity of the literature, is that not all resilience researchers themselves buy into that particular rendition. Some say that they're not sure that it's different from adaptation to normal or ordinary challenges, and that it's really an extension of normative development. Further, those who have tried to study correlates of resilient functioning versus normal functioning don't find any particular distinctive predictors of resilient functioning that are different than what you would typically understand to be promotive experiences in our environments, whether or not we're exposed to risk. So in summary, resilience is defined and justified by its distinction from normative adaptation. And resilient functioning could only be evident in contexts of risk and adversity, demanding a different level or type of adaptation. The second presupposition would be that resilient functioning is uncommon. I led out the talk with that idea. Here's some evidence from the thinking. Those who exhibit behavior that defies or is better than expectations. Individuals who function relatively well despite suffering or adversity that would be expected to cause serious consequences. Now here is the slippage that I am worried about, that a type of adversity that implies or that one would expect someone not to be able to recover from. Those who don't succumb, the resilient are those who don't succumb to these experiences that should be causing them trouble. They show resistance to risk. They escape risk. They have decreased vulnerability to risk. They don't struggle. And perhaps this is because they have something unique about them, perhaps greater flexibility or behavioral elasticity. So in summary of this presupposition, certain individuals function effectively in the face of risk, and they do so unexpectedly and remarkably. Those of you who know the resilience literature will be uncomfortable at this moment because you've read things by Anne Maston, for example, as old as 2001, who said, well, actually, it's more ordinary than it is extraordinary. Well, that aside, all of the material I just presented to you, most of it has come from since 2001, or much of it has. And so there is this really kind of schizophrenia within the resilience literatures themselves. Now, the third presupposition that one could make, that I made as in summarizing these literatures, was that, okay, so we know that resilience means that you have to have had a risk environment, that most people aren't going to do very well in that environment, so says the theory, and especially if it's an environment of extreme adversity like political conflict or war, then the likelihood of survival of that without serious dysfunction is even lower. Resilience, and these are just quotations not relative to political conflict first, but resilience will be lower in contexts of high risk. Children have low odds of success in such contexts, and if risk is sustained, children cannot sustain resilience. Maladjustment is inevitable in the face of marked adversity. As to conflict, people talk about the massive trauma of war, the serious life adversities that it presents. And contexts of war are so extreme, say some, that the mere absence of psychopathology or maladjustment would be the signal. So unable are we to withstand adverse consequences or environments that in environments like political conflict, the standard for survival is even lowered to a level of, well, if you've escaped psychopathology, then you've done well. In other words, most of us are going to be seriously disturbed if we are exposed to these environments. So, by summary then, resilience refers to a unique, non-normative type of functioning that is exhibited in the face of adversity, and because of the debilitating effects of such adversity, resilient functioning is unexpected. Further, it would be especially uncommon in contexts of severe adversity, such as war, where the best that one could expect would be that some people would escape severe psychopathology. Now, that's the reading of the resilience literatures that I happen to be very much in disagreement with, but it seems to be the logic that one certainly could argue, and I think that really does inform our instinctive usage of the term. Well, remember the paradox. Despite the obvious destructiveness of war, and you, of all people in the world, understand what it's like to live in conflict environments, the research literature shows us that the majority of young people do quite the opposite than one would just have expected from this presentation, that most do relatively well. And in fact, it's just a relatively small minority of young people who do manifest severe dysfunction in the face of these severe adversities. And this is the paradox, the challenge that I want to try to address with you is, well, how can that be? If life is such as was just presented through these theories on resilient functioning, how is it the case, therefore, that so many are not being destroyed by those experiences as the theory would suggest? That literature, which finds that most youth are able to move forward with their lives even in the face of severe adversity, applies to whatever realm of political conflict that we study. Many of us have done very serious reviews of these literatures and find that even in contexts where you would, where the severity is extreme, take the case of coerced child soldiers who are coerced to be involved in conflict and coerced to do very serious acts of violence. Most of them also seem to be able to move forward, not magically, of course, but are not completely destroyed by this experience. To be clear, the research will find, and as you do your literature reviews, you'll find plenty of studies which find correlations between exposure to political conflict and some form of psychological disruption, typically PTSD or depression and so forth. But those correlations are often quite weak, and in as many as 20% of those studies, there is no correlation whatsoever between exposure and to violence and mental health difficulties, right? And even in some of those 20%, the correlation is significant, but it's reverse. That the higher the exposure, the better off you are. And there's a whole literature, as you might be aware of, called post-traumatic growth literature. It has its own significant problems, to be sure, but just to make the point that the research evidence is not finding what these theoretical speculations might be about how fragile human beings are in the face of adversity. And here we return to the schizophrenia of the resilience literatures. What the review of research on conflict use shows, which I just described, that is most that are able to move forward without severe dysfunction, it confirms the tangent in the resilient literature which says that actually resilient functioning is more ordinary than extraordinary. Some refer to it as a basic defining feature of human beings, a fundamental characteristic of coping, normal coping skills, or an intrinsic recovery process. And some conclude, as we do, that majorities of people exposed to potentially traumatic events exhibit stable, healthy functioning. Okay, so how do we resolve this dissonance? Concepts, theories, speculations are telling us to expect that in the face of severe adversity we're going to crumble, but then the evidence saying that most of us don't crumble. How do we resolve that? Well, you can attack that cognitive dissonance in a variety of ways. You could reframe it and say, well, the reason is because political conflict or war is not risky. Well, that obviously is not the case, right? I mean, that's emphatically not the case. War and political conflict are unambiguously risky. High exposures to often harsh and brutal circumstances, injury and death, disruptions to essential services, infrastructure, and so forth. So we can't solve this problem by saying, oh, well, the reason most kids are doing okay is because they're really not exposed to risk. Well, of course they are. So you have to tackle the paradox, the dissonance, by either challenging the expectation that few would be resilient, or challenging the findings that most are. So let's do that. There are two problems with the expectation that most young people are going to manifest dysfunction in the face of adversity. One is what we'd call the universality of risk and trauma, and the other would be the statistical determination of risk and trauma. Risk or adversity would need to be considered a stressor to most people. These are conceptual definitions of what risk and adversity are. So those who talk about risk and adversity are saying, well, it is a risk factor or an adverse environment because it is a threat to most people. Trauma, PTSD, as you probably know, is the most frequently studied, unfortunately, outcome for this area. Its own definition would say that a stressor would evoke significant symptoms of distress in most people or would be markedly distressing to almost everyone. So these are arguments that would support the front part of the paradox that, well, all of us are going to be compromised. There are problems with this argument. It presumes that individuals respond to experiences in the same way, that there is some kind of universal response to an adverse environment, and doesn't recognize that culture plays its own role in determining what a risk is, what suffering is, what competence is, what resilience is. That there is not some universal reaction to an event or an interpretation of event, and how you and I, as individuals or as cultures, respond to what surrounds us in terms of challenging our adverse circumstances depends a lot on who we are and our framing of what our events are and our circumstances are. This is particularly the case for political conflict because political conflicts are by definition, by definition surround issues of nationalism, of culture, of identity, of politics, which vary from site to site. They're infused with ideals and values that can impact essential meaning. I'll just divert to a little bit of the research findings that helped me appreciate this myself. I did, over the years, long-term studies with Palestinian kids from the first Intifada, mostly in Gaza and the West Bank, and also a comparative study in Bosnia. I found dramatic differences in how young people talked about their experiences. In both cases, it was shortly post-conflict, and I was asking them to talk about their conflict experiences generally, how they remembered them, how they were involved in them, and so forth. And the narratives were dramatically different as you listen to Palestinians talk and listen to Bosnians talk. Again, the prompt questions were very, very general. In fact, the first question to both of them was, what was your first memory of, in the Palestinian case, of the first Intifada, in the Bosnian case of the siege of Sarajevo? And I allowed them to just talk about what their recollections were. The Palestinian narratives were full of meaning. This was something that was clearly interpretable to them. The conflict was not at all surprising. They understood it to be one in a sequence of struggles of their people that they had been told about by fathers and grandfathers forever in the camps. This was something didn't take them by surprise. They had an understanding of what its purpose was. They had a value as to whether or not it was necessary, and in their minds it was necessary to have this conflict in order to achieve goals that were valuable to their culture. And they had a significant role in playing and contributing to this event. And thus, their narratives of their 6 years of experience in the first Intifada, which by all definitions was extremely chaotic and extremely violent, lots of exposure, lots of participation. Their narratives were not centered on trauma and difficulty and disruption. Rather, their narratives were focused on value, on cohesion, on solidarity, on hope, on contribution. When I was so actually stunned by those findings, because in those days I was more influenced by some of this fuzzy thinking that I'm now criticizing than I am now. I was surprised by this. I thought, well, there must be something unusually Palestinian or unusually about this Intifada, but these kids are doing this is something unusual. We would expect them to be suffering much more. Well, so I then went to Bosnia to do a kind of comparative study, and I thought that was a reasonable comparison. Same-age kids, protracted violence, Muslim culture, historical insecurities, geopolitically, etc. And I had the same kind of interviews with the young people from Bosnia, and there came the trauma that most of us had expected. Their narratives were full of dysfunction by their own admission, full of depression, full of anxiety, full of fear. And as they narrated those experiences, it became clear to me that one of the reasons why their narratives were so different from their Palestinian counterparts were because they could make no sense whatsoever of this conflict. It took them by surprise, literally from one day to the next. They didn't know that they were at war. They didn't know who the enemy was. Quite literally, they described to me how it wasn't until they saw the certain symbols on the tanks that they realized who actually was fighting them. Their classmates all of a sudden disappeared. From one day to the next, a quarter of their classmates were just gone. These were the non-Muslims that had been warned and took off. And so the experience of conflict for them was extraordinarily mysterious, unpredictable, and absent of any type of explanation. And they were also unable to have any type of participatory role in trying to join whatever this conflict was. So this taught me early on, therefore, that exposure to conflict or exposure to violence has no universal consequence, but it's filtered. It's filtered through what we understand to be the purpose of this, the meaning of it, its effectiveness. Will it bring something of value or not? And if we can have some kind of meaning structure applied to this, then we might be better off at dealing with the harshness of the experiences. Whereas if we're in a situation where the conflict is chaotic and random, we have no filter to process that, and then we become perhaps the automatic, or more so automatically, victims of this uninterpretable chaos. I won't say much about the Egyptian project. I've been going now for a year since Mubarak stepped down. I actually arrived on February 18th, a week after he stepped down, and spent a month with young people in Cairo and Alexandria, trying to understand their experiences. And we have now funding to follow them for 2 years intensively, to do a national survey and also a documentary. And so I'm now fully engaged in another population of young people who are exposed to, involved in increasingly, unfortunately, violent circumstances. As you well know, the response from SCAF is now increasingly hostile, and one of our young people was himself actually shot in the face in November when I was there. And so another example of young people exposed to very challenging and difficult circumstances. You talk to the Egyptians, and this is now playing itself out over time. My first interviews with them in February and March were ones who, much like Palestinian experience, were not focused on the violence or the difficulty of the original phase of the revolution. They were focused on the purpose, the revolution. We need this change, and whatever it costs, we need this change. That wasn't, as you can tell, surprising to me by then. Now, as the months go by and the change is not coming, I'm very interested to hear the developments of their own narratives. As they now have to recalculate, perhaps, the meaning of the violence that they're experiencing. Is it going to pay off? Ali, the one who was shot, for example, is wrestling deeply right now as to whether or not his his putting himself at risk on the front line is the right thing to do. Is it going to pay off? Part of him says this is the only way to be a revolutionary, and he wants to be on the front line. And he was actually the happiest I've ever seen him was in the hospital after he was shot, because he felt finally of value and of utility. Well, I think he's rethinking that a little bit now, in part because his mentor, a professor of Islamic studies at Cairo University, was actually quite rough with him after this experience. I happened to be sitting with them at a meeting after he was released from the hospital, and she was critical of his approach. And in the end, she said, "Your blood isn't cheap. Don't throw this away. If you're gonna risk your life, gonna risk your blood, there has to be a payoff to you." That was hard for him to hear. His father came and met him at the same moment. Ali had kept the injury from his parents, but his father came to town to vote. This is the first phase of voting in Egypt, and saw his son. And by this time, Ali's injuries were healed enough where a pair of large sunglasses hid most of the bruising, and his father saw him and looked at him, and his first thing was take off those glasses. And Ali did this, and his eyes were deeply bruised. I could have brought you pictures. It was a gruesome sight. He was shot with what we call birdshot, buckshot in the States, so little metal pellets that just splattered his face and head, and unfortunately missed his eyes. And so he was in trouble. His father was really proud of him, and they had actually a tearful moment of father-son unity, where his father could express his pride and Ali could be convinced that his father was not disappointed with him. That was November. By January, his father was encouraging him to use his intellect to help the revolution and not to go to the street anymore. And my last interview with Ali he was really very torn. He didn't want to believe that the two were mutually exclusive. He didn't want to leave the front line, but he also understood the wisdom of using his skills and his intellectual resources to help. So just to complicate the issue further, the young people are really competent. You are really competent at processing what happens around you, which is largely why I'm so irritated by these theoretical suggestions that we somehow are going to be automatically compromised by some event that happens to us. I'm deciding right now to forego a lot of the formal stuff I had, and I'm just going to go with this flow and give you some time to talk. The problem for researchers is the following. We continue to buy into these inadequate explanations in a variety of ways, which have real implications for what we have to offer those who really need information from us. Because most of the research literature, most of the studies that are being carried out now still frame themselves based on this notion that, well, okay, so kids are exposed to these very difficult circumstances, so therefore I am, as a researcher, I'm going to study what? Well, I'm going to study PTSD, because that's obviously going to be the outcome. Well, that's silly. It's not the automatic outcome. And beyond that, even if PTSD, for example, was a relevant outcome to study, it is only a fraction of what really matters in the life of an individual. And so by choice, we constrict our research designs to only provide information on a fragment of what might be relevant. And what we do also thereby is to foreclose the opportunity we have to to understand the real capacity that all human beings have, and young people no less, have to deal with the circumstances that we face. So we need much more attention to understanding the coping resources, for example, that young people use, that you use as you process the difficult circumstances that you go through. We need to honor that capacity and to study it and to identify the circumstances, for example, in which you're able to do to make sense out of what you're experiencing, and what resources are you able to bring to bear to consolidate that strength that you might have. Thirdly, I would say that the biggest consequence to me for a trauma-focused approach, this is what I've described here that I'm critical of, is a trauma-focused approach where you expect that circumstances have automatic debilitating effects, and therefore you have to document the degree of that trauma. The biggest problem with that for me is that because it's wrong, not only that it's wrong, that most of us are not automatically debilitated, but it forbids us from finding out who are those who really are suffering. I mean, it is clearly the case that many young people, maybe it's only 10% or maybe it's only 20%, but who do suffer dramatically from their experiences with political conflict. And let's be very clear about this. There are many who suffer dramatically, no better way to say it. We don't understand who those people are. And the research models that we're using are not allowing us to provide that information. I would much rather have us accept the reality that human beings are resilient. I mean, resilient is an okay term for me as long as it's a descriptor of human adaptability. It's not something that's unique, it's part of us. We have that capacity in us. That's okay. That's the only use of resilience I'm comfortable with. I'm very uncomfortable with the use of resilience if it implies that we have to find that unique group of people who have managed to survive. Okay, what about those who don't manage to survive? We don't know who they are. We as researchers have not provided you with details as to efficiently figure out who of the population of young people that you are concerned about are really suffering a lot, or who's at risk for suffering a lot. We're not able to help you identify that group of people. I would much rather that we do that as researchers, accept the reality that we don't have to document some level of PTSD in the broad population, accept the reality that most people are going to pick up and move forward after they have consolidated various resources, and find out what I would call are the conspiracy of conditions or circumstances in the environment that have interfered with the natural ability to move forward. Which of our population of young people are compromised and why? And it's most certainly going to be, as I say, a conspiracy of conditions. Is it economic issues? Is it the fact that they lost critical resources in their personal exposure to this? Is it the inability of the systems to restore those resources? Much more consequential to the long-term functioning of young people in conflict has to do with the degree to which their forward movement is compromised by their conflict experiences. That is, the degree to which the resources that they require to move forward in life have been interfered with or deprived. And these are basic things that are quite understandable to anyone. So take education, for example. If you talk to Palestinians from the first Intifada, for example, and ask them what was the most costly consequence of that experience for them, the answer is always my education. It delayed or it stopped my educational progress. They don't talk about PTSD. They don't talk about trauma. They talk about yeah, that for all of its great things, the Intifada was consequential, and that consequence was that it interfered with my education, and I know that my education takes me further. Okay, so we need to see how conflict impacts the acquisition of or the restoration of these resources: education, employment, being able to marry on time. I recall an interview last year with a Palestinian in his 30s. He's part of the study we're doing now, following up youth from the first Intifada as adults. He was very concerned, and I would say he was depressed. He would admit that he was depressed. Well, why? The reason was he wasn't married, and then he traced the evolution of that condition quite clearly. I'm not married because I don't have enough money to support a family. I don't have enough money because I wasn't able to get the education that I needed in order to get a good job. And I wasn't able to get the education I needed because of my experiences with the occupation and the political conflict. We need a much better ability to map the people, the young people in our case, who are suffering or who are at risk of suffering based on the degree to which their experiences with war and political conflict have interfered with their acquisition or restoration of these critical resources. And that will take us so much farther in understanding how to deal with young people than our preoccupation with mental health and PTSD. So my admonition to all of us who do this is to actually radically change our research designs. Those designs need to move away from a singular focus on anything, let alone a singular focus on psychological trauma. Broaden our measurement and understanding of the elements of life that war and political conflict impact. That has everything to do with social life, connections with significant people, with economic life, with education, with cultural issues, and so forth. And to plan explicitly to identify this conspiracy of circumstances that places a certain subset of our young people at risk for long-term consequences of exposure to political conflict. So let me, I'm certain I've forgotten a lot of things that I wanted to say, but I'm aware of time, and I wanted to give you a chance to ask any questions, so I'll stop there.
I think my question is, when we're looking at resilience of youth, how is it different in the case of other age groups? Like, what's specific when we look at youth and resilience in political conflict?
Let me answer that in two ways. That's a good developmental psychology question, implying that young people have different capacities than perhaps children. And I would say that from a purely developmental standpoint, certainly relative to children, adolescents are more able to cognitively process complex issues, right? That being said, the power still comes not from something that's different about youth than is different compared to younger children or adults. The power comes from the explanation of the contexts in which they are living and their need to move forward. So whatever age we're talking about, it is their needs to transition to the next phase of life which we need to focus on in terms of understanding to the degree to which they're going to suffer versus move forward effectively.
Thank you very much. A lot of times we hear people, especially in national agencies, NGOs, who work with youth and conflict and development issues, talk about youth as agents of change, youth as agents of conflict resolutions, not just victims of conflicts, but maybe they can help solve the conflicts. Do you find evidence of that in your research, that youth actually come up with ideas about how to solve these conflicts or at least mitigate them?
It's a great. I don't happen to study that specifically in my own program, but I can certainly say that they are eager to be involved in that process and have lots of suggestions and lots of ideas, and are a invaluable resource in formulating, not only well, that helps me make an earlier point that I missed, and that is that the research that we do, that I've described, is also limited by the fact that we have not attended to the perspectives that young people have themselves. We apply these models of what should be measured on both sides of our equation, and these come from expert renditions about psychological health. And ironically enough, even today, very few of us actually go and talk to young people and to get from them an idea of, what is war like for you, or what is political conflict like for you, instead of imposing on them some framework. So they have lots to say, and they have very mature perspectives as to what's happening, why it's happening. I'm certain that relative to a less experienced, perhaps adult, let's say, maybe their ideas would be more idealistic than may be useful in the end, but certainly they are full and eager to provide explanations for what matters to them and suggestions for its resolution.
Thank you for coming to speak. I have a question in relation to Egyptian youth, whether you see in the future the reaction being more like what the Bosnian youth suffered because they were in a conflict that led to disillusionment.
Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm eager to follow them. I can say, after studying them now for a year, I'll go next week for the 4th round of interviews with a small group of them, is that what remains constant among them is a clear embrace of the purpose of the revolution, its need. What is also clear is their maturation, that revolutions are much harder than it may have felt like in February of last year, that things don't move quickly or systematically. I can tell you that they feel betrayed by the military, who, if we had longer, we could go into the very special relationship that young people felt with the military that they now feel betrayed by. So they're experiencing severe challenges to their hopes, but remain, as far as I can tell, quite committed to moving it forward. When that commitment starts to disintegrate, none of us knows that. I mean, we've been studying Palestinians from the first Intifada now for almost 20 years. They're in their 30s and 40s, and of all people, you might think that they would be soured on the effects of political issues, given their deep commitment in the first Intifada, their tremendous sacrifice, and what, as you know, to be nothing but failure from that, no progress whatsoever. They remain functional, they remain active, they remain competent in most cases. Their attitudes are more cynical, more bitter than before, less hopeful. and part of our study with them is to find out when, during this trajectory of their transition from that period, have they lost, or have their attitudes changed or not. But I couldn't predict for you what will happen with the Egyptians. It will all depend. I can say one thing for sure: it will depend on the political circumstances. It will depend on what kind of government is finally permitted to reign there, and in this case it depends on how much the military is going to intrude on that free expression.
Thank you very much for the lecture. As a political psychologist, I'm very much the question of applied research in that aspect. So since you were conducting research on Palestinian youth, how do you categorize the role of UNRWA, for example? World Relief Agency. So how do you? This is one way to tackle the issue, right? So I feel like I felt like that you open up a lot of matters to public policy making. So here you are. What you would recommend somebody from that perspective, or what should that be? Maybe give more recommendations.
I don't have a clear answer as to the role of UNRWA in the lives of Palestinian experience. There are diverse opinions about that, and that is those are areas that I'm not competent to evaluate. I can only recommend that whatever the service agency might be, whatever the NGO might be, whatever the government might be, our recommendations are to respect the capacity of young people, listen to what they have to say, and provide services that will assure the restoration of the basic resources that are required to move forward. And so whatever the priorities, the priorities of such service organizations need to be the assessment of loss of critical resource and the restoration of those resources, be it education, be it employment, be it reconciliation with key critical members of the society. So, for example, young child soldiers from Africa, one of the key instruments for the restoration of their health, or the assurance that they move forward with life, is actual ritualistic restoration of relationships with the communities that they have injured. So they've done injury to their tribe or to the people of their community, and that connection needs to be restored. And there are ritualistic ways to do that. There are rituals that they go through to do that. There's just one example of how moving forward requires not just the provision of resources, but also the restoration of disturbed relationships. And in the Palestinian case, I don't know if it's under the mandate of UNRWA or not, but what is clearly apparent, and especially in Gaza these days, is the extreme suffering that is being caused by the interfactional conflicts between Fatah and Hamas.
I'm neither a social scientist nor a psychologist, but I have worked as a journalist in Gaza, and while I commend you on your research, I can't help wondering how much time is there for such study? I mean, I have written about children who start out as being really happy and carefree, and they are somehow brought in under the wing of groups who prey on their innocence and who see in them perhaps potential. For example, one Hamas trainer of children who used to bring them around a little camp and train them on playing ball. Good students are targeted for further training because there is no other, as you said, option for excellence or further education. It's just, it connects completely to what you have said about economic conditions and discontinued education. And it has been a few years since I've done that kind of reporting. And now I think Hamas maybe has moved a little bit into more pragmatic ground. But and then you talk about them as 30-year-olds who are bitter and cynical. But what happens to studies such as yours? I mean, as a journalist, I can't but feel a little helpless and impatient. I mean, what happens? What can one do to help such children so they don't have to spend a lifetime before they can choose between what Ali is now facing in Egypt? You know, do I help intellectually or do I go to the front lines? They somehow need more effective intervention at an earlier age. These are perfectly smart, healthy, happy kids. And everybody knows, I mean, the whole world knows, they have economic restrictions forced upon them, they have schools that are being bombed, they have restrictions that are stultifying for any community that finds itself in their shoes. What happens to your study? Does the State Department read them? Does the Israeli government take them into account? What happened? I mean, I really commend you for your work. It's something that's been on my mind for many years. I've gone to Gaza several times and written about these conditions. How do you carry it forward?
Well, I certainly share all of your frustrations. And I suppose each of us tries in our way to make a little contribution. When I was younger, I was naive about how effective I as an individual might be in making change. And I've had to grow up a little bit and realize that what governs the life of most people in this world are powers that are political and political in nature mostly, and I don't have the ability myself or in my research team to change that. So what can I do? The best thing I can do is, with the training and the skills I might have, is to at least provide better information for those who are interested in making a difference in applied realms to use. And I would not, frankly, underestimate the value of that, because the applied world and perhaps the policy world, to the degree that it's even in touch at all with information from the ground, is still persuaded with models that are ineffective and misleading. And so there are a predominance of programs for mental health PTSD resolution. I don't think that's the right way to spend the resources. And I'm hoping that this kind of clarification of what the real needs really are will be useful in persuading donors or policymakers to reorder the priorities and to spend the limited resources more effectively, to find the people who are suffering the most, not to expend resources on young people who are going to move forward without our help. These kind of clarifications, I think that's the best that we can do from our little corner.
discussion or in your research, is there more of a focus on little boys than girls, or do you discuss both genders?
We certainly study both. Males and females. I appreciate the point because most researchers haven't. You can guess who gets most attention. Males, of course, or people aggregate samples and don't differentiate. In our case, we have paid explicit attention to women as well as men. In some cases, we find that the effects are not different. In some cases, there are real issues that need to be addressed that are gender specific. I think again of the example which is not in my research domain, but I'm aware of, again back to the child soldier issue. I mean, there are specific challenges that young women child soldiers have that young men child soldiers don't have, that have everything to do, for example, with the stigmatization of having been forced to have sex by their commanders and they're no longer pure, and to then to face a community which isn't sophisticated enough to differentiate the reason why they became impure, and they have very substantial difficulties that young men don't have. It's just one example of how it does matter to study at the gendered level. But at the broader level, I'd repeat that in terms of the more general model I've tried to define here, it would not be necessarily gender specific.
Any more questions? Comments? Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Barber.